Hi. If you run a medium to large deployment of SharePoint at your company, I'm sure that you'll currently have a number of serious challenges which seem difficult to deal with. Well, in today's video, we're going to quickly cover what these pain points are, and the good news is that I'm going to show you exactly how to fix these problems. So let's get into it. Now, the first thing to look at is the nature of data itself. So data is essentially split into two different types. We have structured data, and that is data that lives inside SQL databases, Oracle databases, and so on. And then we have unstructured data. This is the type of content that lives traditionally on file servers. We have Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, image files, so on and so forth. The interesting thing is that if we look at the amount of unstructured versus structured, we currently have approximately 70% of all data is unstructured data. And on top of that, what we find is that from a growth perspective, we're looking at 60% year-on-year growth for the unstructured data. So this data is growing very, very, very quickly. Now, an additional aspect is to see how data is evolving. So what I mean by that is that we still run file servers and we have content on file servers and so forth, but these days we require better functionality. So these days we work in teams of 10, 20, 30 people or more, and we may all be working on the same project. And if we're doing that, we may be working on the same proposal. So now we need the ability to collaborate on that particular, either one document or multiple documents. So we want the ability to check in and check out the document. We want version control. We want tracked changes per each individual version, or the ability to rewind to a particular version type. We want remote access to our content and get access easily from iPads and iPhones and Windows phones and Android devices and everything. So how do we do that? Well, I'm sure you've all guessed by now, we typically throw all this content into a SharePoint site. And SharePoint itself stores its content databases on top of SQL. And here lies the challenge, because we are now grabbing unstructured data and we're throwing that into SharePoint, but SharePoint lives on top of SQL. And SQL is the definition of structured data, right? So we now have unstructured data living in a structured data environment, and that typically creates issues. On a side tangent to that, we have to look at Microsoft best practices. And Microsoft state that for a SharePoint environment, the maximum database size should be 150 to 200 gigs in size. Okay, I'm going to stick to 150 just to be a little bit more conservative. So if we were to grab, let's say, 10 terabytes of data from our traditional file servers, and we divide that by the maximum database size, that's going to give us the total amount of databases that we'll require for SharePoint. And that's, in this case, 66. Now, if we bump this number up through to 50 terabytes, 50 terabytes divided by 150 gigs is going to now be 333 databases. Now, that may sound like a lot, but I can tell you that this is actually a good level scenario. And what I mean by that is that this is going on the invalid assumption that every single one of the databases in your real production environment is sized at 150 gigs. I guarantee that won't be the case. So what will likely happen in your production environment is that you'll have databases 20-30% of the size of the recommended maximums in order to keep SharePoint efficient. Therefore, that implies that you'll have many, many more databases than what I'm talking about here. We have customers that have 10,000 to 20,000 SharePoint content databases out there. So this thing sprawls out very, very, very quickly. So what are the actual challenges that this creates for all of you because of these two things combining together? So again, just recapping, unstructured data living in a structured data environment being SQL, and the maximum database size restriction within SharePoint. Well, the first thing is, as we've already covered, many databases. And we are typically talking thousands. So the second challenge to that is that we have to back up this content. And as most of you know, backing up SharePoint is challenging, but now when we have to back up thousands of content databases and be able to have granular restore capabilities, that becomes very challenging. Warning. Okay, I just wanted to quickly pause just for one quick second, because you've just seen me mention what may appear to be some very large numbers. I've mentioned a SharePoint environment of either 10 terabytes or 50 terabytes, and therefore requiring thousands of content databases within SharePoint in order to support something that large. Now you may look at that and say, well, my environment is nowhere near that big. So is this solution still relevant for me? Well, let's address that. In order to understand the SharePoint content database size issue, we have to first understand the very basics of SharePoint architecture itself. And don't worry, I'm going to keep this extremely simple. Alright? So at the very top layer, we have what's called the web application. The web application is simply the very top of the hierarchy, and it's identified by a fully qualified domain name. In this case, intranet.mycompany.com. Now, a web application has inside of it one or more containers called site collections. In this case, we have 3 site collections. Now, inside of each one of these containers, we have an object called a top-level site, and we only have a single top-level site within a site collection. Alright, so what's a top-level site? Well, if you recall, the web application up here, this was the intranet.mycompany.com. Well, this particular top-level site might be intranet.mycompany.com/finance. This top-level site over here might be intranet.mycompany.com/legal. This one over here, intranet.mycompany.com/IT. Okay, that's what the top-level site is. And as you can see from the diagram, each site collection has one top-level site, but then 0 or more subsites organized in a hierarchy. Okay, and you can see that each one of these collections looks different, and they can. And just to be clear on that, what a subsite is, let's pick one. Let's say this one, for example. So this one here might be intranet.mycompany.com/finance/Europe. Okay, so that would be this hierarchical structure that we would maintain. So now that we understand that, now we have to look at things and say, well, how does the content database fit into this? Well, the content database, if I draw content DB1, a content database really can tie to this level here. So in other words, within a content database, we store site collections. Okay, this content database 1 is storing 2 site collections, but typically what tends to happen is we will have content over here, DB2, and normally we have one content database linked to a single site collection, right? One content database to one site collection. So now let's get back through to these big numbers that we were talking about before, right? So I mentioned 10 terabytes and 50 terabytes. Well, let's trim that down significantly. So let's say instead of 10 or 50 terabytes, let's go down to 1. All right. So we have a file server over here, and this file server has 1 terabyte. Now, if you recall from what we said about Microsoft best practices, is that the content database stick to a maximum size between 150 to 200 gig. So again, we're choosing 150, all right, just to be conservative. So this is 150 gig in size. So this is for the actual content database. So if we were to grab the 1 terabyte of content and try to suck that in through to, remember this was the /IT department, okay, for this particular top level site. So if we wanted to grab 1 terabyte of content and bring it in through to the IT department for the top level site, we simply could not do that. 1 terabyte does not fit into 150 gigs. Okay? Not doable. So could we do 500 gig? Clearly, no. Could we do 200 gig? Or 150 gig? In theory, yes, but why would you want to create something that's already maxed out? Right? You've got no room for growth, so you wouldn't do that. And remember, I'm just talking about bringing stuff in through to this top level site. Remember, we can have an entire hierarchy of subsites underneath that, and they require their own room too. Okay? So realistically, you would probably size this somewhere at 50% of the recommended maximum or less. This is why before I was mentioning 20 or 30% perhaps. But even if we choose something like 50%, in order to have breathing room, okay, in this case we're talking approximately 75 to 100 gigs of content per site collection, because remember, a site collection has one content database attached to it. So even though we're talking about 1 terabyte of data in this instance that we want to bring in through to one particular top level site, we could not do that. The only thing that we could do in theory is to create 10 content databases, but each one of them are going to have separate URLs, okay? And therefore spread the content across those 10 separate systems and hope that we don't grow too much before we hit our limit. Now, you might look at this and say, well, yeah, sure, that's inconvenient. The fact that I've got to spread out my content across 10 content databases, therefore 10 site collections, each one of them with a different URL. But if that's what I have to do, then that's what I have to do. But unfortunately, there's more bad news, because you actually lose functionality when you have content spread across different site collections. And here's the list of the things that you miss out on. All right, these are all things that do not work across site collections. So we cannot maintain content types. We cannot do content query by the content query web part won't function across collections. The workflows that you create in one collection do not suddenly magically appear in the other ones. You have to manually copy them across. Information management, retention policies, again, they're stuck on the site. Quotas, they're stuck on a particular site collection as well. So all of these are things that you miss out on by having to spread the content across various site collections. Okay, so to recap, you can see that the size of our SharePoint environments really doesn't need to be that big at all before we start running into these problems. So we've got a size issue, and we've got the issue that when we spread content across multiple site collections, we now miss out on SharePoint functionality. Okay, so let's head back to the main presentation. Third thing is that all of this content, if you think about it, the SQL Server, of course, requires disk storage, right? Now, what type of disk storage is this? Well, this is going to be a Tier 1 disk. Why? Because SQL requires fast disk. Well, Tier 1 disk is the most expensive, and it's, of course, the fastest drives that are out there. Now, that can create an issue, because if you think about it, by definition, file server content, which may or may not live on SharePoint, but traditional file server content, maybe 80% of it hasn't been touched for 6 months or more. That's not very efficient, and that's consuming your Tier 1 disk, right? Because it's now on SharePoint, which in turn lives on top of SQL. So now you've got really what could be called stale data that's consuming your most expensive and your fastest drives, while at the same time you may have a division, down the hall that suddenly says, well, we're desperate for storage capacity, and there's basically none left because it's all been consumed by the SharePoint environment. So that creates challenges all by itself. Fourth thing over here is scalability. Okay, and as you can see, all these things are all interrelated, right? So many databases, once we have thousands of databases, that becomes a scalability problem for us to actually grow. But by far, probably one of the biggest issues is that SharePoint itself becomes slow. Why? Well, because once the databases get to this large size, and this is why Microsoft say don't go beyond this particular number, because then it starts dragging down SharePoint performance. And now that we have unhappy users, that tends to roll up through to IT management, through to the IT department, through to the CFO, CIO, basically everyone in between. And having unhappy end users typically is a bad story. So these are hopefully the challenges that you may be nodding along to, saying, yes, I can relate to all that. Another one, by the way, that I do regularly see is people say that they have high availability and disaster recovery challenges with their SharePoint environment because of the complexity. So those are the issues. Now, how do we address those issues? Well, fortunately, there's a relatively straightforward solution to this. So what we do is, first up, just before I show you that, I just want to explain that when we store the content on SharePoint, the content databases, as I've mentioned, do live on top of SQL. But we really have two types of data that now currently live on SQL. We have what's called metadata, and we have what's called binary large objects, okay, or what's typically called blobs. And these two things are combined within SQL. So what we're doing with this particular solution that I'm about to show you is we grab the blob content, which is the bulk of the content. The metadata, if you think about a file, the metadata would define things such as the file name, the date that it was created, date that it was changed, file size, file type, and so on. But the file itself may be 2 or 3 gigs in size. Okay, so the 2 or 3 gigs really is taken up by the blob. The metadata is absolutely tiny. Okay, so when we're talking about unstructured data in a SQL environment, the great majority of the data is really tied up in the blobs, not in the metadata itself. So what we're going to do in order to fix the great majority of these challenges that we face here is we're going to grab the blob content and we're going to put this in through to what we call HCP, the Hitachi Content Platform. Now, the technology that offloads the blobs from SharePoint, really, but it's SQL underneath, we grab the blobs from SQL and we put them into HCP via a technology called HDDMS. And this is essentially Hitachi Data Discovery for Microsoft SharePoint. So for now, I'll just call it HDDMS. But really, the key thing is that we're grabbing the blob content from SQL and we're transferring that through to a separate system. Now, this separate system over here is, we can call this, I guess, tier 4 disk. Okay, so this might be, 10K SAS drives, may have SATA drives in there. It's definitely not going to be tier 1. Maybe tier 3, tier 4, however you choose to define those things. With this HCP technology, it has some unique attributes. So let's look at a few of them. So let me just draw a quick line over here. Now, the first thing is that it's a self-replicating system. And what that implies is that you can have 2 to 4 copies of all of your actual content. And the second thing is that it's actually self-healing. Now, these two things combine to give you what is essentially a backupless environment for your blobs. Okay? So, let me say that again. The fact that it's self-replicating and self-healing, providing you've got 2 to 4 copies deployed, implies you no longer need to worry about backing up your blob content. Why? Because your blobs now live over here within HCP, and HCP is essentially a backupless environment. Okay? Now, does that imply that you no longer need to back anything up? Absolutely not. Okay? Let's make sure I'm clear on that. So, you don't need to back up the blob content, as I've shown here, but we still have 2 other points to actually think about. We still have content databases back on SQL, and we still really have SharePoint front-end systems. And we may have, middle tier systems as well. Okay? So we can't really forget about that. So in terms of the content databases that live on top of SQL, ideally we want to have a more advanced, snapshotting type of technology that enables us to be able to just set this thing up to take snapshots on a regular basis and gives us the ability to have the ability to restore any one of, let's say, hundreds of different types of snapshots that we've already taken. We can choose, number 105, and instantly this thing is restored and we're back up and running with our content database. Now remember, though, that in terms of the content database, we may have moved, let's say, 90% of the content, because remember, the majority of the content is in the blobs, across through to HCP, which really implies that the content databases have now shrunk to probably 10%, sometimes even less, of what they originally were. Therefore, that implies we now can get away with far less quantity of content databases on SQL because each one of them are now far, far smaller. Okay, so we can now consolidate. So if we just look at that by itself. Oh, by the way, sorry, I did forget to mention the front-end systems. Now, SharePoint, if you have 3 front-end systems, as an example, they more or less self-replicate. So if you were to lose number 1, for example, then you can really just rebuild another system, and then servers 2 and 3 will effectively take care of, rebuilding, if you want to put it that way, server number 1, because the content is still available on servers 2 and 3. So really, if you want to take a traditional type of backup, or potentially a snapshot, but something like once a week or once a month, that is typically more than sufficient for the front end. Okay, so again, the 3 tiers here are with HCP. It's a backupless environment, so for all of your blobs, you no longer need to worry about backing those up. With the content databases, it's now effectively 10% of what it used to be, so it's tiny, but again, we do want to leverage advanced snapshot technology that enables us to rewind back through to potentially hundreds of different snapshots or points in time. And then we have a far more relaxed backup on the front-end systems, be it weekly or monthly, however that fits into your schedule. Before I keep going on the potential benefits of this HCP technology, the Hitachi Content Platform, let's just quickly revisit the pain points that we originally listed. So we said that one of the big problems we had is we had thousands of databases. Well, guess what? Now, as I've mentioned over here, we now have fixed that issue, right? Because we now have 10% of the total content within SQL than we originally did, because 90% of that content has been shuffled off to HCP. Second issue that we talked about was backups. Well, that's more or less been fixed, right? Because 90% or more of the content now lives in a backupless environment, right? We no longer need to worry about that. It's self-replicating and self-healing. It takes care of itself. So that's a huge burden that's been lifted. Third issue is that we had SQL stored everything on tier 1. Has that changed? No, it still stores content on tier 1, but it now only needs to store 10% of the content on tier 1. 90% of the content has been shuffled to tier 4. Okay, so we now get huge cost savings with our storage because of this. We had, related to that was the concept of scalability. Well, scalability has now been fixed as well, because again, we've massively reduced the number of databases that we had. We had unhappy users, right? Because we had big chunky databases over here that were close to its maximum recommended size, and therefore that slowed things down. Related to the above, that's now been fixed, right? These databases are now 10% of their original size. And with regards through to high availability and disaster recovery, that itself has more or less been dealt with because of this self-replicating, self-healing technology. So all of our blob content is protected within one site, and we can also have disaster recovery simply by deploying a HCP system through to a separate location. And now it self-replicates and self-heals with that system as well as number 3. So that's fixed too, right? All of the pain points that we have now been addressed. Now, the next thing that I'm going to show you here are just additional benefits that you're going to get. I mean, we've already fixed all of your pain points, right? So that's a great thing. But you're going to get some extra functionality that you basically get for the same price. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Now, this technology in the middle that I've drawn, again, just to remind you, is called Hitachi Content Platform. Now, the first thing that we talked about is the key thing is that it's a backupless solution. So that implies that the content that's stored within HCP is, again, self-replicating, self-healing, therefore we no longer need to back this thing up. So the second aspect to look at now is storage optimization. So we have the ability to dedupe the content and also to compress that content. And I'm talking about all of the content that's actually on HCP. So what that can actually result is in, of course, it's going to vary from customer to customer, but anywhere typically between 30 to, let's say, 50% space savings because of dedupe and compression efficiencies. So now if we look at the compliance benefits, we've got a number of things that we can actually look at. So the first thing is worm type functionality. This is write once, read many. So you write the content once and then you read the content a number of times, but that content remains there no matter what. So that type of functionality can be enabled. We have encryption of data at rest. We have retention and both legal hold of that data. So we can have policies that say, after X amount of time, the content has to be, digitally shredded, or it has to be retained for a particular amount of time as well. Okay, the content can be audited. We can have chargebacks. We've got a whole pile of functionality all wrapped around the compliance umbrella. The last aspect that I'll mention here is the ability to index and search the content that lives within HCP. We already know that we have SharePoint content within HCP, the blob content. What's key about HCP is working in combination with the other technology I mentioned, which was the Hitachi Data Discovery for Microsoft SharePoint, is that we bring across the actual metadata from SharePoint as well as the blob content. Okay, and the result is that now when we search for that content within HCP, we can now intelligently search across everything that's within HCP for SharePoint. Now, on top of that, HCP can be the target for many other different types of applications. As a matter of fact, we have well over 70 or more partners that build technologies that do whatever they actually do, but then with that content that they've now worked with or extracted from whatever target application that might be, they can now offload that content off to HCP in a very similar way to what we've seen here with SharePoint. Okay, so you have now all of these, let's call them bridges, between the various different applications you may already run and HCP on the back end. So you've invested in this technology once, but now you can reap the benefits over and over and over again and get all of these benefits that we've talked about here of the backupless environment, dedupe, compression, tons of compliance functionality, index and search. And what's key is that we can now index and search typically across all of the content that's stored within HCP. Sometimes the applications will be siloed, but in other instances, let's say for example that we grab Exchange data, right? This is email content that lives on your Exchange systems, and we send a copy of every single email, which is called journaling, off through to HCP. Well, now from a single search target, you can essentially now search both Exchange and SharePoint data, all from one location, one pane of glass. Okay, so that's a powerful thing as well. So if we flip back to the prior whiteboard that we were working on before, so again, we've seen that this solution really does address all of the pain points that we listed at the very start. I won't go through them again. They're listed on that right-hand side there for you. We've now also looked at the many additional benefits that we get with the HCP solution that we've just seen on the other slide. Okay. Now, on top of that, there are two additional things that are worth pointing out. Now, from studies that have been run, we've basically seen that the total cost of ownership is essentially reduced, okay, by a factor of approximately 30 to 50%. All right, so TCO reduction of 30 to 50%, and on top of that, in terms of the return on investment of the total solution, we typically see that there's a return on investment in under 12 months. Okay, and this can be as low as 6, 7, 8 months with some of our customers. So you get your money back on the solution very, very quickly. You've got a nice total cost of ownership here that's actually a reduction on what you actually started with, and all of the pain points over here have been addressed, and on top of that you get all of the benefits that we've talked about on the other slide with HCP. So I'm hoping that this video has assisted you in getting clarity in terms of what the issues are, and more importantly, how to go about fixing those problems. One final thing I wanted to mention is that we have a free tool that we can come through to your site and install. And what the tool does is that it essentially hooks in through to your existing SharePoint environment, and from there you can granularly choose a specific site, or if you want the entire SharePoint hierarchy, and it will go through and do an analysis of the different types of document and data that you have stored within SharePoint. It's then going to give you this output that you see on the screen here, which shows you all the different data types and so forth, and it would give you an estimate of the amount of storage efficiencies or space savings that you're going to get by implementing a solution such as the Hitachi Data Discovery Suite for Microsoft SharePoint in combination with the Hitachi Content Platform, similar to what you can see on the bottom right-hand side. And in the instance that, for example, you weren't comfortable deploying an executable that hooks in through to your SharePoint environment, if you wanted to, we also have this additional tool here, which is really just an Excel spreadsheet that we plug in data based on your environment, and from that it does a total cost of ownership analysis. It shows you effectively where you are now and where you would be if you were through to leverage these two technologies that we've talked about today. So again, in wrapping up, hopefully you've learned something new today. Again, if you are experiencing those pain points, please know there's a solution that can easily fix all of them. And if you have any additional questions or if you'd like further information, please contact your Hitachi system consultant or account executive, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to help. All right, thank you.